I never thought I'd see them again. But there they were, standing in the middle of the museum, staring at my painting like they'd discovered some lost artifact. My father had his hands clasped behind his back, the way he always did when he was pretending to be unaffected. My mother stood slightly behind him, fingers curled around the strap of her purse, her shoulders drawn tight like she was bracing for impact. I should have felt triumphant, vindicated. Instead, my stomach twisted into knots. For years, I imagined this moment. Sometimes in revenge fantasies where I'd tell them to go to hell. Other times in desperate daydreams where they finally saw me, understood what they'd done. But now that it was real, all I felt was nothing. I stepped back, retreating into the shadows before they could spot me. 6 years earlier. You're throwing your life away, Andrew. My father's voice was calm, matter-of-fact, like he was diagnosing a patient. I tightened my grip on the duffel bag slung over my shoulder. I'm not. You are. He folded his hands on the table, tilting his head slightly. You think this? He waved vaguely in my direction, as if referring to my entire existence. Is a career? Painting? Art? He exhaled sharply through his nose. That's a hobby. A distraction. It's what I love. My voice came out steadier than I felt. Love doesn't pay the bills, he said, leaning back in his chair. I wanted to yell. To shake him. To make him understand that this wasn't a whim, wasn't some rebellious face. But I learned long ago that arguing with my father was like shouting into a void. I turned to my mother instead. She hadn't spoken the entire time, just sat there, arms crossed tightly over her chest. Mom. Her lips parted slightly, like she wanted to say something. But then, she looked away. And somehow, that hurt worse than anything my father could say. I nodded once. Okay. That was it. No big fight, no dramatic exit. Just a slammed door and the sound of my own footsteps echoing down the driveway. I didn't look back. New York swallowed me whole. I found a shoebox-sized apartment above a restaurant in Queens. The walls were thin, the plumbing questionable, and the heat unreliable, but it was mine. I got a job waiting tables, spending my days balancing trays and forcing smiles, and my nights painting until my fingers cramped. It was brutal. There were nights I went to bed hungry, months where I had to choose between rent and art supplies. But the thought of giving up, of proving my father right, was worse than any hunger pang. Then, one night, everything changed. I was closing up the restaurant when I found a business card tucked under my plate. Just a plain white card with embossed letters. Jonathan Brooks. Brooks Gallery. And scribbled in pen underneath, you don't know how good you are. Call me. I stared at it for a long time. It had to be a joke, right? But something in me, maybe desperation, maybe stubbornness, made me dial the number the next morning. A warm, raspy voice answered. Took you long enough. I hesitated, gripping the phone tighter. Who is this? A low chuckle. Jonathan Brooks. You got my card. Yeah, but I glanced around my tiny apartment, the walls covered in half-finished canvases and crumpled sketches. How did you? I was at the restaurant last night. Saw your sketches on the order pad when you weren't looking. Shit. I should have been embarrassed. Should have apologized, laughed it off. But all I could do was stand there, heart pounding. You've got something, kid, Jonathan continued. I don't throw my name around lightly. Come by my gallery tomorrow. Bring your best piece. The line went dead before I could even agree. The next day, I stood outside Brooks Gallery, my hands clammy, my pulse hammering. I wasn't ready. My work wasn't ready. But I had nothing to lose. Inside, the gallery was quiet, the air cool and still. The walls were lined with pieces that looked like they belonged in museums, not cramped apartments above questionable restaurants. Jonathan leaned against a desk at the back, arms crossed, watching me like he already knew everything about me. He was older, maybe mid-50s, with sharp eyes and salt and pepper hair that made him look like someone who had seen everything. Show me, he said simply. I swallowed and turned the canvas around. It was raw, abstract, but deeply personal, bold strokes of red and black, emotion splattered across the surface. Jonathan tilted his head, studying it. The silence stretched. My throat tightened. Then, interesting. That was it? Not good. I asked, unable to mask the crack in my voice. He chuckled. You kids always think art is about good or bad. It's about whether it makes people feel something. And this. He exhaled. This makes me feel like I got punched in the gut. I blinked. Come back next week, he said, setting the painting aside like it was already his. Bring more. Jonathan took me under his wing. For the next few months, I juggled shifts at the restaurant with stolen hours in the gallery, absorbing everything. He taught me how to price my work, how to talk about it, How to exist in an industry that didn't care about starving artists unless they were dead. You're a brand now, kid, he told me one night over whiskey in his office. People don't just buy art. They buy you. I thought it was bullshit at first. But then Jonathan hung one of my pieces in a group show, and suddenly, strangers were asking about me. Some even bought my work. I wasn't rich, not even close. But for the first time since leaving home, I wasn't drowning. And then, out of nowhere, Lauren walked back into my life. I was setting up for another gallery event when I heard a voice behind me, light, familiar. Andy. I turned. Lauren stood there, a glass of wine in one hand, the other resting on her hip. She looked the same, sleek brown hair, sharp cheekbones, but something in her eyes flickered with recognition and regret. Lauren, I said, my voice carefully neutral. She let out a soft laugh. God, I almost didn't recognize you. You actually did it, huh? A year ago, that sentence would have destroyed me. Now, it barely made a dent. I leaned against the wall, arms crossed. Yeah, I did. She smiled, but there was something off about it. Like she was seeing me for the first time, realizing she'd underestimated me. Or maybe realizing she'd been wrong. I saw your name on the flyer, she admitted. I had to come see for myself. I took a slow sip of my drink, mirroring her smirk. Well, Lauren, what do you think? Lauren swirled the wine in her glass, eyes scanning the gallery walls. Her gaze lingered on my work, like she was trying to decode some hidden message, something I'd left just for her. I think. She started, biting her lip. I think I was wrong about you. A year ago, that sentence would have set my whole world on fire. Now, it barely made a dent. I leaned back against the wall, crossing my arms. Yeah? What part? She let out a small laugh, but it didn't reach her eyes. All of it. I didn't think you'd actually, she gestured vaguely at the room, at the neatly dressed collectors murmuring in admiration. I mean, it's impressive, Andy. Really? The way she said my name, like it meant something again, made my stomach twist. But I wasn't that kid anymore. The one who needed her approval. So why are you here, Lauren? I asked, voice even, almost bored. She hesitated. I don't know. I just. Her fingers tightened around her glass. I saw your name, and I remembered all those nights in my dorm room when you'd show me your sketches, talking about how you were going to take over the art world. She let out a soft, breathy laugh. And I told you to be realistic. I remembered, too. I remembered the way she'd smiled at me fond, but condescending, while telling me it was time to grow up. That art was nice, but it wasn't a career. I gave her a slow nod. Yeah, you did. She looked at me then, really looked at me, as if seeing the difference. The sharper edges, the confidence I'd earned in sleepless nights and calloused hands. I was an idiot, she admitted, voice quiet. A small part of me, the part that used to dream about her, wanted to let that sit between us, like some kind of redemption. But the rest of me? The part that had fought to get here? I just shrugged. You wouldn't be the first. Her mouth opened slightly, like she wanted to say something else. But before she could, someone else approached, a tall man in a navy suit, expensive but not flashy, the kind of guy who carried himself like he owned the room. Andrew Carlisle, he said smoothly, offering his hand. Big fan. Lauren stepped back as I shook his hand. Her presence faded into the background, and just like that, she was nothing but a footnote in my story. My career took off faster than I expected. Jonathan kept pushing my work, getting it into bigger galleries, introducing me to the right people. He had a way of making things happen, pulling strings I didn't even know existed. You're a name now, kid, he told me over dinner one night. Keep this up, and you'll be selling pieces for 6 figures before you hit 30. I laughed, shaking my head. Feels like a dream. He pointed his fork at me. That's because you haven't woken up yet. And maybe he was right. Because the next month, one of my paintings sold for 70 grand. And then another. And another. Suddenly, I wasn't just surviving. I was thriving. I moved out of my shoebox apartment and into a loft in Brooklyn. Bought real canvases instead of painting on whatever scraps I could find. I even quit my restaurant job, not because I had to, but because Jonathan sat me down and said, you don't need a damn safety net anymore. Stop acting like you do. For the first time in my life, I let myself believe it. And then Jonathan died. It happened so fast. One day, Jonathan was leaning against his desk, laughing about some collector who tried to haggle down a 5-figure painting like it was a yard sale. The next, I got a call from his assistant. Heart attack. Gone before he hit the ground. I just stood there, the phone pressed to my ear, the words not making sense. Jonathan was indestructible. He was the kind of man who walked into a room and owned it. The kind of man who didn't just build artists, he built legends. And now he was just gone. The funeral was small, private. A handful of people from the art world, a few distant relatives who barely knew him. It felt wrong, like he deserved something bigger. I stood by his grave long after everyone else left, hands shoved in my pockets, staring at the name etched into stone. You don't need a damn safety net anymore. I swallowed the lump in my throat. Guess I don't have a choice now, huh? The wind carried my words away. A week later, I got a call from Jonathan's lawyer. He left you something, the guy said, voice clipped and professional. Can you come in tomorrow? I had no idea what to expect. Maybe some old sketchbooks, a bottle of whiskey he never got around to finishing. I did not expect the gallery. He left it to you, Andrew, the lawyer said, sliding the papers across the desk. The entire business. I stared at him. That doesn't make sense. He had partners. Investors. The lawyer nodded. They're being bought out per his will. He wanted you to have full control. I shook my head, my pulse hammering. No. I don't know how to run a gallery. You didn't know how to sell a painting, either, the lawyer said, not unkindly. But Jonathan saw something in you. Guess he still does. I looked down at the papers. My name, printed neatly on the deed. I thought about all the nights Jonathan sat across from me, sipping his whiskey, watching me like he was waiting for me to realize something about myself. Maybe this was it. Maybe he always knew. Owning the gallery changed everything. Suddenly, I wasn't just the artist people whispered about at shows. I was the guy who ran Brooks Gallery. Collectors, artists, critics, they all wanted to know what I was doing next, what kind of talent I was curating. At first, it felt like too much. I was 25, barely getting used to success, and now I had a business to run. But the more I leaned into it, the more I realized something. Jonathan had already taught me everything I needed to know. So I built the gallery into something new. Something that still had his spirit, but with my own mark on it. I gave unknown artists the same chances Jonathan gave me. I took risks, pushed boundaries. And it worked. The gallery flourished. My name became even bigger. My paintings were selling for 6 figures now, and I wasn't just an artist anymore. I was a force. And then, one night, as I was locking up, my phone buzzed. A number I hadn't seen in 6 years. My mother. I stared at the screen, my mother's name glowing in the dim light of the gallery. For a second, I thought about letting it ring out, just turning off my phone and walking away. But I didn't. I answered. There was a pause, just breathing on the other end. Then, Andrew. I hadn't heard her voice in 6 years. It was thinner now, weaker somehow, but still hers. I swallowed, my throat tight. Mom. A longer silence. Then, a shaky inhale. We saw your work. I exhaled through my nose, pressing my fingers to my temple. Yeah? Took you long enough. She ignored the bitterness in my tone. Your father and I, we went to the museum today. They had your paintings in the main exhibition. I knew. Of course I knew. It was one of the biggest milestones of my career. But hearing her say it, like it was some revelation, made something in my chest twist. He didn't say a word the whole time, she continued. Just stood there, staring. I clenched my jaw, picturing it. My father, the man who threw me out, standing in front of one of my pieces, unable to look away. Good. Andrew, she said softly, almost desperate. Can we meet? Please. I wanted to say no. God, I wanted to. But something in her voice, something fragile, kept me from hanging up. So, against my better judgment, I agreed. We met at a cafe near the museum. Neutral ground. When I walked in, my mother was already there, hands wrapped around a coffee cup. She looked smaller than I remembered, like the years had worn her down. And across from her, my father. I almost turned around and left. But then he looked up. And for the first time in my life, he looked uncertain. Andrew, he said. Just my name. Nothing else. I sat down. Didn't say a word. Mom glanced between us, then exhaled. We should have never let you go. I let out a humorless laugh. Yeah, you shouldn't have. She winced. My father didn't react, just stared at his hands. We lost the firm, she admitted, voice shaking. Your father made some bad investments. We lost everything. And there it was. I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms. So what? You need money now. Her eyes went wide. No, that's not. She looked at my father, pleading. Tell him. For a long time, my father didn't speak. Then, finally, he looked at me. I was wrong, he said. It was the first time in my life I'd ever heard those words come out of his mouth. But they weren't enough. You threw me away, I said, my voice low, steady. You made me feel like I was nothing. And now, suddenly, you want to reconnect? He held my gaze. Yes. I scoffed. Why? Because I'm successful now? Because my paintings are worth more than your house. He didn't flinch. Because I saw them. I froze. He exhaled, running a hand down his face. I stood in that museum, looking at your work, and his voice faltered. I finally understood. I clenched my jaw, my hands curling into fists. It took this for you to get it? He nodded. Just once. I wanted to hate him, to tell him to go to hell. But instead, I reached into my bag and pulled out a wrapped canvas. I slid it across the table. Mom hesitated before unwrapping it. Her breath hitched. It was one of my earliest pieces, when I painted in that tiny apartment, back when I had nothing. You wanted something from me, I said. Here, take it. She looked up, eyes glassy. Andrew. I stood. We're done here. Then I walked out. And for the first time in my life, I felt free.